June 17th, 1972. Worked for the Post for 9 months. They had this, it looked like a local burglary at the Democratic headquarters. Police story. I covered the night police beat. It was a Saturday morning. I think the summer. Editors looked around and thought, who can we call in? Who would be dumb enough to work on this story on a Saturday morning? And they thought of me immediately. And so I went to work with about 7 or 8 other people, including Carl. And I went to the arraignment of the 5 burglars, and the judge wanted to know where one of them worked, and he was mumbling. He wouldn't say, kind of going, and the judge said, where? He went, the judge said, speak up, where do you work? Where did you work? And he went, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. And I know my reaction was one of, oh, this is not your average burglary.
First or second day, really. I mean, in the beginning it didn't. It was strange. You had a lot of Cuban, Spanish-speaking guys in masks and rubber gloves with walkie-talkies arrested in the Democratic National Committee headquarters at 2 o'clock in the morning. What the hell were they in there for? And what were they doing? And when the next day, I mean, we covered that story, but the follow-up story was based primarily on their arraignment in court, and it was based on information given our police reporter, Al Lewis, by the cops, showing them an address book that one of the burglars had in his pocket. And in the address book was the name Hunt, H-U-N-T, and the phone number was the White House phone number, which Al Lewis and every reporter worth his salt knew. And when the next day Woodward, this is probably Sunday or maybe Monday, because the burglary was Saturday morning early, called the number and asked to speak to Mr. Hunt. And the operator said, well, he's not here now. He's over at such and such a place. Gave him another number. And Woodward called him up, and Hunt answered the phone, and Woodward said, we want to know why your name was in the address book of the Watergate burglars. And there was this long, deathly hush. And Hunt said, oh my God, and hung up. So you had White House, you have Hunt saying, oh my God. You had, at a later arraignment, you had one of the guys whispered to a judge. The judge says, what do you do? And Woodward overheard the words CIA. So God, I mean, if your interest isn't whetted by this time, you're not a journalist.
Is the CIA connected to this? Well, it turns out a lot of CIA people were, and they tried to use the CIA to cover up the FBI investigation, but they never pinned it on the CIA. It was a White House operation, so you would not go from the CIA to the White House instantly, but within several days, through the work of another reporter, we learned there was this cryptic entry in the address books of 2 of the 5 burglars. Very simply said, H. Hunt -W House. And so I called the White House and asked for Mr. Hunt. And he came on, and I said, why is your name in the address books of these 2 burglars who were caught in the Democratic headquarters? And he screamed out, good God, and hung up the phone. And there was a sort of, as I've said, I am packing my bags quality to his voice that didn't tell you everything you needed to know, but certainly got you focused on you know, this is interesting now. And of course, it turned out he'd worked for the CIA for years, been working in the White House as a consultant to Chuck Colson, who was then Nixon's hatchet man.
We were being very careful as the stakes increased and as the White House looked more and more threatened, and Nixon himself looked more threatened, and ultimately his office became threatened. We just were determined that we weren't going to make any silly mistake. We made one mistake in a story in which we said that Woodward and Bernstein said that there was a slush fund of $300,000 set up in the committee to re-elect the president, and it was controlled by Haldeman, and that one of the witnesses had testified to that slush fund to the grand jury investigating Watergate. And I've forgotten which one it was, but the following morning, Dan Shore of CBS, like we saw on CBS Morning News, shoved a microphone in front of this guy and said, "The Post says you did this, did you?" And he said, "No." And the whole town shook as far as I'm concerned, because that was the first time we had been accused of getting anything wrong. What it turned out was that the question hinged on whether or not he'd told that to the grand jury. And since he hadn't, he was able to say no. He wasn't asked, was there a slush fund, which of course there was. Turned out that he hadn't been asked. And that interested us a great deal, because if the prosecution wasn't asking him those interesting questions, that suggested that there was a reason they weren't, and the reason might be that they were trying to cover it up. Anyway, it took 2 days, and we got confirmation that there was, and in fact there was a slush fund of $750,000. And so that gave hope to the Republicans. And of course, all of the Republican spokesmen had a field day beating us upside the face over that. But it didn't last very long. Thank God. I can't remember, but there were so many. I mean, Haldeman, yes. Ehrlichman, yes. All of the guys who later went to jail. Mitchell, yes. It was inconceivable that Nixon wasn't. But of course, with the tapes, that all became academic when the tapes came out. But and then it came out in the Irvin Committee hearings in the Senate, and Woodward, we were told that before we could write it. But yeah, we knew it was, and that was when. It was so important. The whole reputation of the paper was hanging on that. By the time, because most of the rest of the country was, you forget there was an election on in '71, and they were all saying, "Well, the Post is just playing politics and all that stuff."
We were reporting on the president's men and the White House people, the Attorney General John Mitchell, people in the Nixon campaign committee to re-elect the president, and the focus was not Nixon, and it was only later when Dean testified and the tapes came out that it was quite clear that not only was Nixon involved, he was in charge of the cover-up. That was the key, the important discovery for Carl and myself was that Watergate wasn't isolated. There were other burglaries. There was a whole intelligence gathering apparatus. There were spies in all the Democratic candidates' campaigns that had been planted and were paid by the Nixon campaign. That they would sabotage campaigns, things that seemed to be simple and innocuous, but were quite devastating, false press releases and accusing people of various activity and so forth, and a kind of sowing the seeds of discord. There was a letter forged saying that Muskie had made some disparaging remark about Canadians. And Muskie got very upset, and it was never conclusively established that this had been done by the Nixon campaign, but one of the people in the White House acknowledged to one of our reporters that he had written it. And Muskie, in the emotion of the campaign, was trying to explain what had gone on. There'd been some disparaging remarks elsewhere about his wife, and he cried. And in the snow in New Hampshire, and standing on the back of a flatbed truck, and generally believed that was the end of his candidacy. And of course, Muskie was going to be the strong candidate against Nixon. The guts are supplied by the owners of the newspaper and the editors. They back, and have always backed what I do, and in a sense I'm out there doing it, and if there's pressure or debate or controversy, they're absorbing that pressure. Certainly during Watergate, it didn't get transmitted to Carl Bernstein or myself. Through them, they were, keep going, get to the bottom of it. About 6 months after Watergate, after Carl and I had written almost all of our main stories, she called me up for lunch. And she had a style of, I want to know what's going on, I want to offer some ideas, kind of parse it out. But she wasn't the editor, she was the publisher. She had what I call mind on, hands off. She was intellectually engaged in the news, but her hands were not directing, not saying, investigate this, don't investigate that, give the emphasis here. That was Bradlee and the editor's job. But she was quite curious, quite well-informed, plugged in, and she said, when will we know the full story of Watergate? When will all the truth come out? Quite optimistically. She posed this, almost suggesting that it was inevitable. And my reaction was, as I told her, I said, well, Carl and I think that it will never come out, that Nixon and his White House are so good at obscuring things, of sealing off information, preventing disclosure, that we'll never know. She looked at me quite stricken, said, never? Don't tell me never. And I remember thinking and feeling quite motivated that she was saying the standard here is, the bar is quite high. Don't tell me never. Get to the bottom of it. That your resources, the resources of the newspaper, should be directed at completing this story, getting the full tale, if you would. And it, in many ways, is, I think, the principle under which she and her son, Don Graham, tried to run the Washington Post. Don't tell me never. Don't let things elude us. It's our job to figure them out.
They were not hard to support, these young reporters, because they were right. Every time the White House denied something, the evidence became clear that it was the White House that was lying. First, the spokesman at the White House, Ziegler, and some of those guys, and next the Attorney General, Chuck Colson, all of those people, the White House aides, were lying, and Robert Dole. And Dole's successor as the chairman of the Republican Party was George Bush the First. These guys they lied because they didn't know the truth, and they couldn't believe that they were being lied to. I was at the Washington Post, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I believed it because I knew it was coming. We knew it, but we couldn't, we were being told by the people who were telling us that if we publish it, he'll change his mind and won't resign. So, we started phrasing it close to resignation, debating resignation. And then finally, we learned that, I think that he was going to do it at 9 o'clock at night, or 8 o'clock at night he resigned. And well, I was down there I lived in that place in those periods. And we were so scared that we were going to, by this time we knew that the front page was going to be a historical document. It was going to be reproduced in the history books. And we wanted to be sure that we got it right and be sure that there wasn't a typo. In those days, he worried terribly about typos. Wouldn't be sure that it wasn't sabotaged in some way by printers slipping in the F word or something like that was going to screw it up. And we had to be sure the headline was right. We had to be sure it was terribly critically important that we do it right and that we not brag, not seem to be bragging, and that we didn't allow any television in there for days. Well, I was worried about the Post's image of all of this, and that there would be a segment of society who said, they were out to get him, those bastards, and they got him, and it was going to be. We were just very careful. We had such good sources. One of the sources that I can now reveal, I have talked about, was Senator Goldwater, who was a great friend of my wife's family, and I used to talk to him all the time. I'd have drinks with him, all of late July and early August, and he would be going over to the White House to give Nixon the news that he didn't have any support. His support in the Senate was eroding, and he was the one who said that he told me first that he was going to resign, wasn't sure when, and for God's sakes, don't write it as hard because he won't. So we were terribly worried, and we didn't. And it's a big newspaper and a lot of people in it, and you can't control all of them, even if you wanted to. So we tried to just keep people out of the building. We didn't allow any television people in. We didn't allow television in for 6 months, I don't think. And then when Redford wanted to film the movie in the Post, we told him he couldn't. He wanted to film it from 3 in the morning till 8 in the morning. And we just told him it was not possible. We had really done a really good job that in the face of the difficulties that they put up to prevent the truth from coming out had been overcome. And that really is what we're all about. And it seems to me that, let's be sure for the record to say that it wasn't just the Post. The Post played a critical role in the beginning, and Woodward's and Bernstein's came in at critical moments with, they were the first to reveal the tapes, and they were always ahead of the curve, but there was a lot of great reporting done by other people. Cy Hirsch, the Los Angeles Times, they did really good work.
We had done some of the early stories. It led to the Senate Watergate Committee, led to the House Judiciary Committee and impeachment investigation. The Special Prosecutor Cox and Jaworski investigated this, put lots of people in jail. The Supreme Court ordered the president to turn over his tapes, which really sunk him, smoking gun tapes at the end. So I had just a sense that we had done some of the first work on this, that any suggestion that we had caused it or brought down a president was a stretch, to say the least, and not factual. That we had done stories, but it is a process of the judiciary, the Congress, the Supreme Court, that led to Nixon's demise. But then, of course, if you think about it, Nixon is the one who did himself in. Nixon, the piston driving the Nixon administration was hate. Nixon was a full-blown hater. And if you listen to the tapes, it's chilling and frightening. We wanted to use the presidency as an instrument of personal revenge, to settle scores too often, and that's not what the presidency is about. And what's sad about the Nixon presidency is not just the criminality and abuse of power, but the simple truth, to the best of my knowledge at this point on those tapes, no one ever says what would be good, what would be right for the country, what would be best for the country, which of course is what a president is supposed to do. It seemed to always be about Nixon. How does this affect me? Nixon, the president. How do I pay someone back, either good or bad, for what they have done to me?
Pentagon Papers was a study commissioned by Nixon, the end of his first term, 68 or something like that, 69. And it was to see if they could find the origins of our involvement and what went wrong. And it was led by Bob McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. And there were 7,000 pages finally. And the New York Times got a copy of it. Well, they got it, and they had it for 3 months, and they started to publish it. And we had heard that they had this big blockbuster coming up, and suddenly, they just dropped us on us. And they, on one morning in June, I think, of 71, they led the newspaper with it, with 8-column banners across. My God, it looked like the end of the world. And we led the paper that day with Tricia Nixon's wedding. And we looked, to me, it was embarrassing. They had this great story and we didn't. Our lawyers were telling us that this New York judge had ruled that the statute says whoever has reason to believe that publication of certain information will threaten the national security of the United States shall be. This was a civil suit, but the criminal equivalent which they would certainly have done had they convicted us, would have put us to jail, put us all in jail, including Katharine Graham, or the possibility of it. And once you're convicted of a felony, you can't own television stations, so it would have cost us all the television stations. I think there were 2 or 3 then, but I think there's 6 now. But there was a lot of money on the table. She decided to do it. Finally, the night before we published, came the critical moment, and we were in my house. The reporters were all there, and the editors were there working on the copy, and there was some guy writing for the next morning, and it became a time where we had to get her okay, and the lawyers started off by telling her. The lawyer was one of the greatest men, even though he didn't approve of publishing it. But he said the way he told her that was just so important. He said, I think on balance, I'm against it. I mean, he didn't tear his hair out and say, "God damn it, Catherine, you can't do this. It's risked the whole thing." And a bunch of us were on, I think I had 4 phones in my house, and she was on, the lawyer was on one of them, and the editors were on the other. And we told her she had to do it. It just had to if she ever wanted to be taken seriously, you know. I mean, I shudder to think the way we put it. But she finally said, "Well, okay," I say, "we'll publish it." And the 3 of the journalists all hung up immediately because we didn't want any, you know, we had what we came for, and we didn't want to let her change her mind. And we published the next day. We missed the first edition, but we published it, the second edition, which came out at 11 o'clock at night, 11:30. You don't think of journalists as automatically as patriots, one. You don't think of them as real authorities in the question of what is classified and what isn't, and what is a threat to the United States and what isn't. But in fact, at that time, we were. I mean, we were more expert than a lot of the government witnesses who testified against us, like an Assistant Secretary of Defense who had been, you know, a year or 2 before head of a big Republican contributor and a head of an automobile company, and you know, sold cars in Omaha or somewhere. And so you know, most of us had served in World War II. Most of us had quite fancy security clearances in that capacity. So we did, and there was no threat to the national security. And information, truth, is not a threat to security. And we believed that. And you know, 18 years after the Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't shut us down, the prosecuting attorney, who was the Solicitor General of the United States, wrote the Post a letter saying there was none in the whole Pentagon Papers. There was no threat to national security. His name was Griswold, and he was the had been the dean of the Harvard Law School. I mean, he was no rank amateur himself. So they were after us in the New York Times, and why? You know, you have to forget that the Attorney General, you have to remember that the Attorney General who prosecuted us himself was the first Attorney General and only Attorney General in the history of the United States to go to jail.
This is a book I did in 1999 that took the 5 presidents after Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, the first Bush, and Clinton, and analyzed the special prosecutor law and showed how that and the new climate of congressional activism, media activism, meant the presidency was going to be forever altered, that it was going to be scrutinized and examined, and each of these presidents had their own way of responding. What was interesting, most of them didn't realize that the world had changed, that they wanted to have a whole they wanted to have a whole presidency where they could do what they wanted and no one would examine them or scrutinize them, and they got in trouble, a lot of them, because of this.
How about the Boston Globe and the Catholic Church? There's an example of incredibly good reporting of over a long, protracted time period, laced with denials by the highest people in Boston society, the cardinals and the priests. I mean, I know a lot about that story because my son was the editor at the Boston Globe who ran that investigation. And I think that's a perfect example of how newspapers can persist in the face of denials and correct wrongs. I mean, that's why we all joined this business.
We would frequently do competing drafts of stories and put it together, and I recall in that incident, I did one, he did one, and I looked at his, and I realized his was better, as was almost always the case. Much better writer. We looked at it differently. There was a competition between, who's going to get what lead and put it together, and sometimes I was thought to be the more cautious one, but Carl could be cautious, and I could be aggressive or overly aggressive. Taught me the benefits of collaboration. I think collaboration is a wonderful thing. I now do my books alone, but I have a full-time assistant who is kind of my collaborator. I didn't like the Navy, I didn't like Vietnam, and didn't like the war, and I was disappointed in myself that I didn't figure out how to adjust to being a part of this that I didn't like, and so I didn't quite have the guts to run away or stand on principle. It was a difficult time to be associated with something you're pretty sure is not right. You can't prove it's not right, but you think it's not right. And my last year I served in the Navy here in Washington, and lived over on P Street, and decided I would get a subscription to a paper called the Washington Post that had a young, very feisty editor named Ben Bradlee, and started reading the Post. And during that year, 1969 and 1970, you could just feel the energy in the newspaper. You could feel that they took not an adversarial position toward government, but a position of skepticism, a position of there is accountability reporting. Why did this happen? How did it happen? What's secret? What's not known? What does it mean? And I was, in a sense, there were the two worlds of the Navy, where all the opposite principles seemed to prevail. And then there was the Washington Post there on my doorstep every morning, kind of saying, wait a minute, what's the government up to? What is this secret government we have? I was going to go to law school after 5 years in the Navy, so I was age 27, and I got a job at a weekly paper in Montgomery County, Maryland, for $110 a week. And I called my father, who was a judge at that point, or about to become a judge, and said, I'm not going to law school, but have this job in a newspaper he'd never heard of. And my father, a man of great restraint, non-judgmental, in fact, said probably the severest thing he's ever said to me. He said, "You're crazy." And at the same time, it was my decision. So he didn't think it was a good idea. He always saw me as a lawyer. To a certain extent, I always saw myself as a lawyer. And I was going on an unknown path, and that concerned him. But when I got into it and then went to work for the Post, he was quite supportive. If somebody came from Mars to America and went around for months or years, and then you ask them who has the best jobs, they'd say the journalists, because the journalists get to make momentary entries into people's lives when they're interesting and get out when they cease to be interesting. In most jobs, if you're a lawyer or a doctor, you have to deal with clients, patients who have boring problems or diseases that are routine, and of course the definition of news is non-routine. What's going on in the town and culture and the nation and the world is news, and you get to work on that. I was born in a hospital in Geneva, Illinois, but lived in Wheaton, which is the home of Billy Graham, the evangelist, so it was very fundamentalist Christian. There were no bars in town. People who went to Wheaton College had to sign a pledge: no drinking, smoking, dancing, movies, playing of cards. And so it was the classic kind of Winesburg, Ohio, small town. My father was a lawyer there, and I worked as a janitor in his law office when I was in high school, and started reading the files and discovered that the projection that people in the town made about their own lives was in fact not who they were, that lots of them had secrets, and many of them were in my father's law office files. As defendants, as tax cases, divorce cases, the full catastrophe of litigation. And in it, you just saw that it was not as pure and simple a community as the members like people to think, that people had troubles and people had secrets. I had teachers at Wheaton Community High School, a history teacher named Elizabeth Dunnican, who taught American history. It was a great teacher and very forceful, very insisted that we write essays to answer questions and not short answers. Somebody who, through force of personality, made history interesting and important. It looked like I was going to become a lawyer, and my father, to a certain extent, was my model. He was a very well-regarded lawyer in town. I remember going around and explaining, giving my name to lots of people, and they'd say, "Oh, you're Al Woodward's son. He's a good lawyer, fair man." I didn't start reading seriously until probably junior high school. And I had a friend who read books like Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. And I had fallen in love with some books at a younger age, like The Swiss Family Robinson, adventure stories. But I tried to read Crime and Punishment and read some other books, and then in high school took a course reading books, and that really kind of focused me on the value of a book. We read pretty much the range of classics, and nothing kind of really jumped out or are books that I have distinct memories of. The distinct memories I have of books are from college. William Faulkner's books, certainly probably one of my favorite books is All a King's Men, Robert Penn Warren's book about political corruption in Louisiana and about a reporter who watches this and gets to participate and see, but doesn't have all of the full consequences of the action fall on him. It's the nature of the business. You get to see other people's lives, and you chart the rise and fall of others, and you're not that involved. You are an observer, and you kind of have to work pretty hard to preserve your outsider status, but that is what you get to do as a reporter. What Faulkner's trying to do is get to the interior, and in the end, as a journalist, you're trying to get to the interior. You're trying to understand somebody's reasoning and their emotions and the demons they may or may not have. You are trying to find out what really happened, and of course, as I now recall, Faulkner novels, the characters are trying to find out what happened. It's not clear, it's obscure, and events are in no way simple or cinematic. Events are filtered through minds and memories and prejudices, and it's quite, you feel intimate with his characters. I don't know whether I feel pride. I think pride is hubris. I think it is an emotion that if you bask in it, it's like hate. It will destroy you. And so I don't make those kind of assessments. I like what I do. I'm repeatedly struck by how I miss part of the story always. And that is one of the managing editors at the Post, Howard Simons, during Watergate. This was not on a Watergate story, but I was struggling with the story early in my time at the Post, and he came by and he said, "You don't have to understand a man in an afternoon. In other words, you don't have to do it in a day, and you won't achieve understanding of a person or an issue in and slow down, take your time, dig, go back, and no one goes back or slows down or digs enough, particularly me." I think journalism is a practice, like law, that you keep learning. You are trying to get it right and you never do, and that there must be a sense whenever you get to something and then realize 2 weeks earlier, 2 days or 2 minutes earlier, you didn't know that. And it's critical that no matter what you do, you're never going to have the full story. And that so you are dealing a glancing blow to what's out there. You want to deal a careful glancing blow. You want to spend time on it. You want to make sense out of it. You want it to be fair. But in the end, it's only a glancing blow. Obviously, there's not one American dream. There are hundreds of millions of American dreams. And what in my business I've found is that we basically do have a free press, that we can operate independently. But the real input comes from people who believe in a free press, believe in the First Amendment, believe in open discourse as much as possible, hate secrets, hate secret government, hate secret concentrations of power. And so in an odd way, those in my business have a million allies out there, people who are basically truth tellers, want to help somebody, know that the truth is cleansing, that the truth is a good thing, that the society needs to function on that, and that in a little way, and often in a significant way, that's realized, that we do explain enough about what's going on, that I think in the atmosphere we're in now, somebody who would get up and propose some of the things that were done in Vietnam, like conducting the war when you didn't believe in it, or burglarizing, or wiretapping, or doing the abusive things of Watergate. I think it's so ingrained that there are enough people who would stand up and say, we can't do that. We shouldn't do that. That doesn't mean there won't be more scandals and maybe even larger scandals, but in a sense, the vision or the dream of the people who wrote the Constitution has, at least in part, been realized. Yes, I mean, that's the standard cliche about Watergate. The system worked, and it did. It took a long time, and if you examine the sequence, you could identify hundreds of points where the road to full disclosure would have been, the thread would have been cut. So it's not inevitable that the system works. In fact, it probably doesn't work that often.